We hope you enjoy the following video presentation sponsored by the C.S. Lewis Foundation. We are a nonprofit organization with a mission to equip and encourage Christians to live their faith within the world of ideas and arts. To help us continue to host events and make videos like this one, please make a donation after viewing the video by going to www.cslewis.org or clicking the link below. Thank you.
I speak to you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. By some strange confluence of circumstances, as incomprehensible to me as they are sheerly delightful, it falls to me to ascend the winding stair of thought and speak to you about the life of C.S. Lewis. Really, Lord? Very well. I accept the task. In the words of St. Mary the Virgin, may it be with me as you have said. Lord, behold your servant. I am charged with giving almost exclusively in this conference the plenary lecture that looks carefully at Lewis's biography, tying the events of his life into the implications of the theme of this conference. And my thrill at being asked almost immediately died away and at the daunting enormity of the task at hand. But as Sir Gawain says, it is for a man but to try. And so I do. When I began to think and pray about this talk, I soon despaired of the task, for the concept of calling seems mostly absent from what Lewis says in his letters and his views about how he sees his own life. If Lewis had a profound sense of vocation, he doesn't seem to talk about it much. But out of that despair, hope. After a conversation with my wife, I soon realized that Lewis's life clearly answered to a kind of clarion call toward collaboration. And so I shall begin by inviting you to look afresh on the facts of Lewis's biography, this time through the lens of collaboration. I propose that we look at the whole of the life of C.S. Lewis in a new way. I invite you to see with other eyes and to recognize in Lewis's life a helpful pattern or framework to organize our thinking about both his formidable life and our formidable lives as well. I want you to think about what you know about Lewis's life as an answer to the call to collaboration, and to see his circumstances in terms of a series of successes and failures when it comes with how he worked with others. Joseph talked about defining our terms. I think it's a beautiful place to begin, and so I offer you the most helpful definition I know. As many of you have no doubt read in Bandersnatch, Diana Pavlik Glyer cogently and correctly asserts that collaboration involves much larger patterns of participation, patterns that affirm the value of individual talent while at the same time recognizing how much we can benefit from the presence of others at every stage of the work we do. Got it? Think of that definition again. Patterns of participation that affirm individual talent and recognize the benefits of the presence of others. This description serves almost as a summary of what Lewis attempted to do in the whole of his life. If you're at all familiar with his biography, you're probably 6 steps ahead of me by now. Successful and failed collaborations. I suggest that we look through Lewis's life through that lens, both failed and successful collaborations, and as you attempt to apply that collaborative framework to Lewis's biography, it'll seem rather obvious. From writing Boxen with Warney in the little end room, all the way to where T.S. Eliot posthumously changed the author's name on The Great Divorce, worked with Lewis to change that name so that people would have it under Lewis's name, not an anonymous name, a pseudonymous name. Once we look for it, we begin to see collaboration everywhere. So let's start looking at this lens of successful and failed collaboration, looking at Lewis's early life. I suggest that there are two successes of collaboration particularly worth noting. First, I believe that Lewis's parents, Albert and Flora, certainly benefited from each other's presence as they parented their sons. Reading the letters between them shows a fairly compatible, faithful, and loving married couple doing their best to raise their two bright boys. Indeed, Lewis refers to his boyhood as happy, but for so happy, ill secured, in quoting Milton. Although Albert was perhaps too much attached to his job, and his parenting style tended more towards pontificating than a more personal approach, Lewis's parents worked quite well together. His mother was an extraordinarily educated woman for her time, and she excelled in maths, which famously troubled Lewis all his life. Her commitment to logic and to language certainly found a home in both of her sons, the younger in particular, and her husband's deep interest in literature and especially in oratory also took root in the boys, particularly the younger Lewis. A successful collaboration. Another hallmark of collaboration took place in that little end room of Lewis's home in Belfast. I mean, of course, as I alluded to, Boxen, the boyhood combination of Warren Lewis's India and Clive Lewis's imaginary animal land. Here they spent hours writing and drawing and produced together maps and histories and dialogues filled with politics and adult-sounding talk. It was, and still is, deadly dull stuff. But the boys developed there and continued on all of their lives much larger patterns of participation. And these would follow them throughout their lives. And in a small way, that collaboration in the little end room set the stage for the Inklings. Perhaps that room was the first iteration of The Bird and the Baby. Certainly, Lewis's collaboration with Warnie in that shared room began and continued all of their days. But two remarkable failures of collaboration followed hard on the heels of Lewis's happy boyhood. The first was precipitated by Flora Lewis's death of cancer when Lewis was just 9. In many crucial ways, the young Jack Lewis's development, in many ways crucial to the young Jack Lewis's development, that death precipitated the central relational failure of his life. Albert Lewis lost his sons, Albert Lewis and his sons lost not only a wife and a mother, they irreparably lost each other. I sometimes wonder if the wrong parent died. Although his mother was not perfect, the settled happiness that Lewis found in his family while she was alive sank, famously like Atlantis. And Lewis was thrown like Odysseus onto the rocky islands of life with his father. And much like Calypso, Albert held Lewis as a kind of captive, proving himself for the rest of his life both far too present and far too far away. He would rifle through Lewis's pockets and allow him little enough time alone. But when Lewis needed him the most, hours before arriving on the fields of France on his 19th birthday, Albert refused to leave his work routine in Belfast to visit his son who begged for his presence. Lewis begged him to come, but to no avail. And something there was torn that was likely never mended till both men arrived at that place that awaits us. That place where the bitterest of tears are wiped away. There were no patterns of participation for Albert Lewis and his younger son. Rather, Lewis formed patterns of deception, distaste, and perhaps even disgust at his father's inabilities. Lewis later and often referred to the way he treated his father as abominable. But I'm not sure Lewis wasn't the more offended than he was offender. His father, in crucial ways, abandoned him. Surely we can see this relationship as a failure of collaboration. And one of the worst ways Albert failed his son was by sending him to boarding schools almost criminally unsuited to the young Lewis. Here we see nearly a critical failure of benefiting from the presence of others. One wonders what would have happened had Flora been well and be able to participate better in those decisions. Lewis's studies, his reading, his developing philosophy, and his theology all suffered from the increasing displeasures and downright horrors of his schooling. Perhaps worst of all, Lewis found no friends. Instead, his time away separated him from his two oldest and closest friends, his brother Warren and his neighbor Arthur. But God is not daunted. Even his time away bears a blessing, for we know much about the young Lewis's life through the letters that he wrote that we never would have known had they been nearer. Read his letters to Warnie and Arthur Galahad. Ironically, though, this failure of collaboration has proven as much a blessing for us as it was a bane for Lewis. Nothing can stop grace. All things work together for good, even the terrible failures of collaboration in Lewis's young adolescent life. Sadly, those failures continued into Lewis's teen years. He had no taste for sport, making him eminently unsuitable to games at his schools. He languished outside the inner ring of school society, and his existence in essence resembled that of Eustace Clarence Scrubb at Experiment House, complete with bullies and no allies. Lewis's misery finally reached his father's ears effectively enough for Albert to make one of the best decisions of his life. He sent Jack to William T. Kirkpatrick. Anyone who has read those glorious passages of his release to the red beef and strong beer of Kirkpatrick's tutoring and dialectical style can see how eminently successful collaboration worked so much good on Lewis for the rest of his life. That rigorously rational mind that could preside over the Socratic Club and write mere Christianity was forged in the fires of Jack Lewis's daily collaboration with the Great Knock as they went at it hammer and tongs day after day. But this success was followed by that heartbreaking failure of Lewis at the end of his teen years, begging his father to come and visit. He never recovered. I suggest that this failure of collaboration with Albert led to the strange collaboration that Lewis experienced for the rest of his life with Mrs. Moore. Albert suspected her and didn't like her all that well, but it was he himself that drove Jack Lewis into her arms. Or at least into her homes. We'll let the debate about that continue another time. Collaboration, successes and failures. Did it continue in Lewis's 20s? Of course it did. Guns and good company. In the trenches of France, he met men like himself and wrote poetry as the bombs fell. He also met men very unlike himself, military men, and there began to learn the language and the accents, stumbling at first, as is evidenced by his failures to speak to the RAF, but he began to learn to speak to men and women outside of his social class. This happened in the trenches. God is not daunted. There was a successful kind of collaboration with Mrs. Moore, and whatever the nature of their relationship, she provided domestic stability for Lewis for the rest of his life. She provided a lot of things that he had to do, and perhaps his studies, his work, certainly his money would have been better spent elsewhere, but she provided him with storge, with home, with a structure to come home to. Another success in his 20s, as much as Lewis despised the distasteful society of his peers in boarding school, the moment he gets to Oxford, he begins to join every society that he can. The Linguistic Society, the Mermaids, the Martlets, the Coal-Biters, and the Inklings. He was a very clubbable man when he met collaboration that he could deal with. In the 30s, this successful collaboration continued. The Hobbit was born within the context of the relational collaboration of the Inklings. The Allegory of Love was written during some of this time, and a successful collaboration with future Inklings, Charles Williams, also began in the 1930s. Lewis wrote Williams a fan letter for his book, The Place of the Lion. Williams was hard at work at Oxford University Press dealing with Lewis's allegorical love poem study. They became friends immediately, and almost in his first letter, invites Charles Williams to come and visit the Inklings. If you've read those letters, those invitations are few and far between and hard to come by. Warney came home in the 30s, and it was a successful and a failed collaboration. We were talking at dinner last night about Warney's binge drinking, which would land him in the hospital. And Lewis would dutifully go and rescue his brother, dig him out of a hospital in Ireland, dig him out of various bars. A failed collaboration, yes, but as we've seen with Lewis's life with Mrs. Moore, he liked having things to do. He liked being responsible for others. In the 1940s, we see continued collaboration. There were a number of successes. The English syllabus, the election of Adam Fox as professorship of poetry. That was Lewis and Tolkien saying, we're going to make our buddy a university professor because we got the cachet to do it. And they did. That's part of the reason that not far from the memorial stone in Westminster Abbey, you'll see a memorial stone to fellow Inkling, Adam Fox. They worked together. In fact, they perhaps used their cachet to get Adam Fox elected professor and lost it to get Lewis elected professor later. Charles Williams comes to Oxford for the war, becomes an instant Inkling. They like him so much, they threaten to burn him. He went at it hammer and tongs with them. They called him monkey-faced and the most angelic of men. His clotted prose. It was difficult to understand, but he was welcome there at the Eagle and Child and in Lewis's rooms. And of course, in the 40s, the successful collaboration of the new Hobbit. Chapter after chapter of The Lord of the Rings was read at the Inklings. Successful collaboration, resonance, editing, clashing. Tolkien says, I love coming to the Bird and the Babe and hearing the roar and knowing that one can dive right in. One of the first things that they would say at the Inklings meetings was, fill up. They meant their tankard of beer and their pipes, but also their hearts and their hands and their souls. But the 40s also had collaboration fail in those crucial ways that would set the tone for Lewis's entire life, and, if I do what I'm about today, perhaps even change the way we have been thinking about him for years. In 1945, Charles Williams dies unexpectedly. In 1950, Minto, having begun to lose her mind, is committed to a nursing home. Lewis goes to visit her every day until she dies in 1951. In 1947, Dyson says, no more hobbits, which effectively made it mean no more Inklings. Can you picture Tolkien reading Aragorn and Gimli and Galadriel and Hugo Dyson walking in, and to see those pages in manuscript rolled up and stuffed in his jacket pocket. If ever there was a failure of collaboration, here it was. Dyson's grave is at Holywell Cemetery. It's right around the corner. Go and pay your respects. But forget not that not only did he preside over the death of the Inkling, he presided over the birth of Lewis's faith. Because if you go a little further along, you'll come to Addison's Walk. And after Tolkien went home to Edith, Hugo went back with Lewis, and from 3 to 4 o'clock in the morning had finished the long night talk that led directly to Lewis's Christian conversion. We as friends, as lovers, as collaborators sometimes do as much harm as good. We will pray that God will plant deep and prosper well the good, and by the power of the Holy Spirit, someday later soon, blow away the harm that we do. It's unclear how much Warney's alcoholism was present in the late 1940s, but we know that Lewis lived in the thread of it. Domestic disputes, and always wondering if this second or third or fourth drink of Warney's was going to lead to a binge. He lived in terror. By the end of the 1940s, he felt cab horse tired and thought that all of his best work was behind him. The Inklings die in 1947, and in 1948, he begins writing up a vision he had had when he was 15 of a faun walking through a forest full of snow. It's important to remember that Narnia was not a product of the Inklings. It was a product of their death. In some ways impossible to prove. I wonder if Lewis was lonely for the proto-Inklings of the little end room, lonely for the chief Inkling Warney, who was unreliable and at times crucially absent. The snowfall of mails that came upon Lewis once he wrote the Screwtape Letters, Warney would help with, but not when he was off drunk. Perhaps the loneliness of the failure of these collaborations led to Lewis reminiscing about a time when he used to write stories of dressed animals. And he began to write some more. By the 1950s, with all of these losses, Williams, the Inklings, Warney to some degree, Minto certainly, Tolkien is preparing to retire. They're at different ages and different stages. And I think that Havard is right that the surprise is not that Lewis and Tolkien fell apart. The surprise that two men so different were ever such close friends at all. But that separation, Tolkien says, began with the appearance of Charles Williams and then the strange appearance of Joy Davidman. But they were never as close as we like to think. Perhaps Tolkien oversells that. Lewis called his meetings with Tolkien the brightest spot of the week, and they were meeting 3 times a week for years. But there were failures. There were losses. There were also professional losses of collaboration. Lewis became a hated man in Oxford, as we heard Stan talk about yesterday. He was also hated in Cambridge. But that hatred led to his losing the professorships, the Merton Professorship, the Goldsmith Professorship, and the Professorship of Poetry. Lewis was languishing, being surpassed by men far his junior in both age and ability, partly because of the hatred that he engendered at Oxford for speaking for the Lord. He was lonely. He had few friends. And when Lewis was lonely and had few friends, well, we'll see what happened again. All of those successes of the late 40s and early 50s were followed by, or those failures were followed by a success. Cambridge creates a chair, a professorship for Lewis. He's welcomed to warm and loving colleagues, some of whom are still alive. We'll see that college next week. He also, in the late 1940s, began receiving letters from an American lady. Do you know that Joy Davidman typed up the manuscript for Surprised by Joy? It was an inside joke. This emptiness led to a space into which Joy Davidman could come. They were unprecedentedly immediate friends. It takes 9 years for Lewis and Ruth Pitter to very politely exchange first names. I suppose you must now call me Jack. Joy's calling him Jack within a year and a half and long before they meet in person. There was an instant, deep, abiding friendship. They began working together right away. Maybe Lewis didn't give this much thought, but I certainly have. In the acknowledgments in the Oxford History of English Literature in the 16th century, excluding drama, oh hell, Lewis thanks Miss Joy Davidman for help with the proofs. Not Mrs. Joy Gresham, as she was at the time, Miss Joy Davidman. That's another talk. She helped him typed up Surprised by Joy. He helped her with her financial needs. There was instant friendship. There was something of storge that began to happen. He helped her in her household relationships and setups. Simon Barrington Ward was the chaplain at Magdalen College, Cambridge, sat next to Jack at table every day. Several years ago at an Oxbridge in 2011, I had a chance to sit with Bishop Simon and Malcolm Geit, and he said Lewis certainly lit up anytime Joy was in the room, and that was long before he married her the first time or the second time. Lewis was falling in love. That's quite a collaboration. Warney certainly loves her. There's an immediate collaborative friendship between them. The result of this collaboration and friendship, successful working together and appreciating each other, was a book factory. Lewis says, I'll put up a plate at the door reading Lewis, Lewis, and Lewis, Inc., Book Factory. Stan, we should put that right below the blue plaque. Joy says in her letters, the house is practically a book factory. If that's not collaboration, I don't know what is. Joy in her letters says, though I can't write 1/10 as well as Jack, I can tell him how to write more like himself. He is now about 3/4 of the way through his new book, Till We Have Faces. What I'd give for that energy. And he says he finds my advice indispensable. Doesn't that sound like a Bandersnatch? Doesn't that sound like collaboration? But I want to talk about so much more than that. So I'll leave you to reread your biographies and think through and find your own examples of failed and successful collaborations. But I warn you, once you look through this lens, you may not be able to stop doing so. But so what? What does this do? Well, I think that looking at Lewis's life through the collaborative lens that Diana has opened to us by looking at Lewis's life as a series of successful and failed incidences of intellectual hospitality, as she talked to us 3 years ago at this conference in such a way that her words still ring. I think if we start looking at him through this lens, it will help us to get our arms around him, which is a mad task. Famously, we'll never get to the bottom of him, but we're beginning to at least sound where some of the depths are. And the framework that Diana started in her book and in her talk, and that I'm trying to collaborate with, I think will help all of us to begin to understand him in a new way. It also helps us understand that calling is fundamentally and by its very nature collaborative. If I am to be called, I must create a space within me to hear another voice. calling is essentially collaborative. If one hears a call, another must have called. Now, I don't know about you, but calling, when it happens for me, needs another voice. How many times have I awoken in the middle of the night and heard what I thought to be the voice of God? It comes so clearly sometimes, doesn't it? But most of those times when I rush to my wife, to my friends, with the golden gleam still fresh upon my brow, I find hesitation in their counsel. Their voices add to the chorus, and in the abundance of counselors there is wisdom. And that voice of God is clarified, sometimes even contradicted to my safety. None of us pursue calling alone, for if we did, we wouldn't be here. It's collaborative. Our job then, here's a practical application of what we've done so far, but tighten up your belts, we've got farther to go. Our job is to collaborate, to work out God's call on each of our lives within the context of the body of Christ. Do it over lunch, today. Do it in your breakouts and in your marriages and your friendships and your relationships when you sadly return home. I don't know how I can call it home much anymore, having been here. Let us understand also what is the crucial nature of collaboration. We find it in 1 Corinthians 3, chapter 9. For here the King James serves us best. For we are laborers, co-laborers. We are laborers together with God. Ye are God's husbandry, ye are God's building. We are co-laborers. The work of the gospel, the relationship with Christ, is fundamentally collaborative too, and it is that relationship to which he calls us and will not stop. We work together with God. We are his hands and his feet. Isn't it miraculous when God uses you to work in someone else's life? Doesn't it feel like a miracle? More crucially, we are called to co-labor with Christ. I don't know what this means, but he says that we fill up his sufferings. The work of the cross was full and complete and sufficient for all mankind for all times. It was finished, but it keeps going on, and it keeps going on in us. We fill up Christ's sufferings, whose work was complete to save the whole universe. I do not know how that works, but it is the word of God, and I say yes, amen. If you don't understand your suffering, and we all have them, of course, at least know that God has invited you into the work that allowed love to come into the world permanently. Do not despair in your sufferings. Do not give in to carrion comfort. You can do something. Wish day come. Not choose not to be. Fill up the sufferings of Christ. Joseph pointed it out too. To live in holiness means to suffer. Thanks be to God. He has graciously granted that we may suffer. He gives it to us as a gift, not a gift I want, but a gift that I need if I will be like my Savior. And as John prayed yesterday, so that all may come within the saving embrace of him who stretched out his arms of love upon the cross. It's a call to collaboration. And as we shall see, a call to love. I want to dispel an old notion that I have been part of perpetuating. C.S. Lewis was surprised by... If I were to say C.S. Lewis and what is the most important thing in his life, joy would be on the top of your list, right? Sehnsucht, longing, joy. It defined his life. Embarrassingly, this very foundation has given 2 conferences, Faith Set Free, C.S. Lewis and the Quest for Joy, Fling Wide the Gates, C.S. Lewis and the Pursuit of Joy. Embarrassing because that's not what Lewis is about. Embarrassing to me because I was part of picking those titles. But I think we've been wrong about joy. I know I have. The concept of joy doesn't matter much to Lewis at all. But we can be forgiven for thinking so, because at the beginning of Surprised by Joy, he calls this pursuit of joy the central story of my whole life. But joy is fundamentally solipsistic. Solus ipsus. Only me. Joy, thrill, longing. It's about Lewis and what he went through. If you look at Surprised by Joy, it came to him through various things, but it was never collaborative. It was always about him, and then about him trying to reproduce this feeling inside of him, or this longing for a feeling of inside of him. And he became more navel-gazing than the worst of the ghosts in The Great Divorce. In early prose joy, Lewis calls joy it. He doesn't call it joy, even though that word is already in his vernacular when he writes early prose joy. He refers to this longing as it. It is a dangerous word, and I'm going to offend some of you now. Sorry, there's no way around it. Well, I'll offend you in just a second. The word it not only means joy. Albert and Warren Lewis referred to Jack as it. He was kind of precious and kind of full of himself, and so they kind of referred to him, oh, well, it comes home next week. Lewis thought he was it. I think so too. It is joy. It is Lewis. I'll be as delicate as I can. In his teenage, atheistic, sensualistic, fleshly letters to Arthur Greeves, Lewis talks to Arthur Greeves about it, which means, well, pleasure. Alone. That is it. Joy is it. Lewis is it. Joy is solipsistic. Joy is alone. Joy is not collaborative. But that is not enough. If you look at the first words if you look at the last 2 words of Till We Have Faces, Book 1, it says no answer. And then the narrator goes on to highlight those words again and again. No answer, no answer, no answer. We're required to pay attention to the last 2 words of Till We Have Faces, Book 1, no answer. If we're required to pay attention to the last 2 words, why don't we pay attention to the first 2 words? That book opens, I am old now and have not much to fear from the anger of gods. The last 2 words, no answer. The first 2 words of Book 1, I am. I am no answer. I am no answer. I am no answer. Joy, pleasure, pang, solipsism, me alone is no answer. And the crisis of faith that Lewis has at his conversion, that he makes clear in early prose joy, is to even posit that there is a thou, that there is somebody other or outer than himself. He can't think past himself. That's the end, the nihilistic end of materialism. I is all that materialist philosophy will leave you with. And then Oriol realizes, Lewis enunciates, it's true, I am no answer, but there must be an answer. Joy is no answer. Let's look to Lewis's words himself in 1953. He writes, what in conclusion of joy? For that, after all, is what the story has mainly been about. To tell you the truth, the subject, joy. He's written a whole book about it, the central story of his life. But at the end, he says, The subject has lost nearly all interest for me since I became a Christian. I believe that the old stab, the old bittersweet, has come to me as often and as sharply since my conversion as at any time of my life whatever. But I know now that the experience, considered as a state of my own mind, had never the kind of importance I once gave it. It was valuable only as a pointer to something other and outer. Joy turns us outer. But what can be more important than joy? In the preface to Surprised by Joy, he says, how far the story of joy matters to anyone but myself depends on the degree to which others have experienced what I call joy. I have been emboldened to write of it because I notice that a man seldom mentions what he has supposed to be his most idiosyncratic sensations without receiving from at least one of those present the reply, what? Have you felt it too? Joy produces what? You too? What you too is a key phrase. In The Four Loves, Lewis says the typical expression of opening friendship would be something like, what you too, I thought I was the only one. He meets Arthur Greaves. Do you like that? Do you like that? You like that too. My happiest hours are spent with 3 or 4 old friends. You too. You too is the opening phrase to philia, friendship, love. Joy only serves to point us to the only thing other and outer of joy that even matters. It points us to love. And that is everything that Lewis is about. For the better part of his life, friendship was the defining love to Lewis. He found family love with Albert. He found family love with Mrs. Moore. He was surprised to find romantic love late in his life. It's a signpost to something other and outer. When Charles Williams dies, Lewis writes a poem. Of whom now can I ask guidance? With what friend concerning your death, Charles, is it worthwhile to exchange thoughts unless it were you? When Charles dies in 1945, Lewis doesn't have a friend to talk to about it. Not Tolkien, not Warney, not Albert, not Barfield, nobody. But there was later a friend that he found because he was surprised by joy. He wasn't surprised by joy, he was surprised by love. She's the ultimate collaborator. What was joy not to me? She was my daughter, my mother, my pupil, my teacher, my subject, my sovereign, and always holding all these in solution, my trusty comrade, military, my friend, my shipmate, my fellow soldier, my mistress, but all the same time, all that any man friend, and I have had good ones, has ever been to me, perhaps more. She was the love that Lewis had experienced all his life, friendship, and all the other loves combined. He was surprised by love. Why? Because my own eyes are not enough for me. I will see through the eyes of others. Here, as in worship, in love and moral action, I transcend myself and am never more myself than when I do. Joy points inward to the self. Love points outwards to the call to collaboration. Let me close this way. The earth was of many colors. They were fresh and hot and vivid. They made you feel excited until you saw the singer himself, and then you forgot everything else. It was a lion, huge, shaggy, and bright, and it stood facing the risen sun. And what does he say? Narnia, 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 awake, love. Think speak, be walking trees, be talking beasts. Love calls us out of ourselves, calls us to Christ, and calls us to share that love shed abroad in our own hearts. But I warn you with Lewis's words, there is no safe investment. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything in your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. The only place outside of heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. As you learn from the great divorce, hell is self. Heaven is other, especially that one other. There's so much more work to do on this. We need to look at Lewis not about joy. You need to think about C.S. Lewis, and the first thing that needs to come to your mind is love. Venus and Eros. He's reading Coventry Patmore, and Patmore's talking about love. The allegory of love is written right when he's coming to faith. Nobody's done that study to combine his scholarly work with his personal salvific journey. Love is the overarching, underlying theme of everything Lewis does. And I challenge you, from this day forward, when you read Lewis, think love. As Jack Redford so prophetically said, let love be our last best word. The call is a call to love. There is no other theme. The first word is love. The first word in Narnia is love. The last best word is love. The Alpha and the Omega of our lives, of Lewis's life, of all that we do, the Alpha and Omega, the word is love. And our charity must be a real and costly love. I'm finished. I'll end with Lewis's words. Is it easy to love God? Asks an old author. It is easy, he replies, to those who do it. I have included 2 graces under the word charity, but God can give a third. He can awake in man towards himself a supernatural, appreciative love. This, of all the gifts, the most to be desired. Here, not in our natural loves, not even in ethics, lies the true center of all human and angelic life. With this, all things are possible. And with this, where a better talk would begin, mine must end. Perhaps for many of us, all experience merely defines, so to speak, the shape of that gap where our love of God ought to be. It is not enough. It is something. If we cannot practice the presence of God, it is something to practice the absence of God, to become increasingly aware of our unawareness. Of what? Of love. I believe if C.S. Lewis would have us respond to the calling of his life, he would urge you today to love. Follow the 3 great commandments. Love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. Treat yourself with the extravagant love of God. And from that grounding of being accepted in the beloved, go out and love your neighbor. And love the Lord your God. Forgive the Edmonds in your life who betray you. Go out and get those poisonous little beasts like Eustace and help them out of their dragon skins. Comfort the dying. Give life with your words. And each day listen to that other voice. Let that other, larger, stronger, quieter life come flowing in. The voice, the life, the calling of love. Thank you.